What's up, you sweaty nerds and greasy degenerates? So Powercreep and Honkai Star Rail. Everybody talks about it, whether it's player, content creator, or your mom. And we got a couple more patches before we hit the 3.0 block, and things start to really crank up again. But we also found out before we entered the 2.0 block that there was a lot of high-powered characters there. So is Powercreep just prevalent in Honkai Star Rail all the time? Does it even really exist? Or is it just kinda a buzzword to use? So let's get into this. There are timestamps down below, so feel free to skip ahead if you felt so inclined, because we are going to talk about a bunch of different things that have occurred in the Honkai Star Rail's overall timeline since the launch of the game. Now, I first wanted to go over something that you guys will probably find really interesting, and I found really interesting too, within the umbrella of some of the recent, what some might call, power creep within Honkai Star Rail. Roughly 6 months ago, I put out a video going over the top 5 best characters in Honkai Star Rail, and since that time, only one of those characters would still be considered a top 5 character, and that's Ron Mei. Every single other one, Jing Liu, Dan Heng, even Sparkle, and Fu Xuan have fallen down at least a peg or two on the tier lists and on my own personal tier list as well, pushing them outside of the top 5 best characters in the game. And that's kind of crazy to think about, right? Like, 6 months is not all that long to have already pushed out so many of the top characters out of their top slot. Only one of those characters gets to remain in the top slot for their category, and that's, of course, Ron Mei. Now, yeah, sure, since launch, we've gotten 2 new 5 stars every single patch. Only patch 2.6 with Rappa will we likely only get 1 new 5-star for that particular patch. So yeah, you are probably going to see more powerful characters moving amongst the top slots faster than a game like Genshin Impact, for example, which you only get 1 new 5-star every single patch. So if you are going to experience power creep in a game, it's probably going to happen with a game that has an accelerated release schedule like Honkai Star Rail does when compared to some of the other gacha games in the space. But it is also natural for a game as it marches down its timeline to continuously increase the power level of the content you are fighting against, meaning that they typically will release characters to accompany that increased power level that you have to perform at. For example, if you're a player that's been around since roughly the launch of the game and the game never tries to challenge you more or give you something new and interesting to play, you're going to probably get rather bored. So the game naturally will increase the power level of enemies, and that means they're going to have to increase the power level of the characters that they continue to put out in order to constantly adjust to the new meta that's being created. So is Honkai Star Rail actually experiencing power creep? Or are they just experiencing the natural progression of their game, and because they have a faster release schedule than some of their previous games, it feels like power creep when really it's just an accelerated pace? So let's investigate this further by going over the top DPS slot for Honkai Star Rail and how that top DPS slot has changed hands over a course of time. When Honkai Star Rail released, so did Seele, and she was definitively the best DPS character in the entire game, wasn't even close, right? And then, roughly 2 or 3 patches later, Dan Heng and Bibitor Lune came out, and he became the new definitive best DPS in the game. Then, I'm not even kidding, 1 patch later, the next patch, Jing Liu released, and she became the next DPS character at the top slot. However, the gap between Dan Heng and Bibitor Lune and Jing Liu was not that big. In fact, for many months, to this day, people still argue whether Dan was better or Jing Liu was better. You ask anybody that knew anything about the game, and it was Jing Liu, but the gap was not that big, so it wasn't super easy for a lot of people to be able to tell, especially if they only had one of the characters and not the other, or neither of the characters, right? So I just wanted to point that out because it is important to note that it wasn't what I would consider to be power creep with Jing Liu over Dan. I would just consider that to be like yet another good character released in the game. But then patch 2.1 came out, and Acheron was released, and she became, bar none, hands down, easily the best DPS character in the entire game. She was in a league of her own. And since Acheron's release, we ended up getting 2 other major powerhouses in the game in the form of Firefly and in the form of Fei Xiao. who are the best characters in the DPS slot for their specific meta, meaning that Firefly is the best breaker in the game, and Fei Xiao is the best follow-up attack character in the game. And obviously, since a lot of these characters' initial releases, support characters have been released that ended up raising the power level of some of these characters, such as Sparkle for Dan Heng and Bibitur Lune, or Jiao Cho for Acheron. Now, some of you might hear all of that and think to yourself, well, obviously, Honkai Star Rail suffers from power creep, but let's actually talk about this more seriously. Now, I'll be the first to admit that it's just easier a lot of the time when speaking to somebody or making a thumbnail as a YouTuber that, you know, this character is power creep or this character is that. But those are just buzzwords, right? Those are just things to get you to click on the videos, and then we can explain ourselves in the video of what we really mean. But I don't consider every single one of those scenarios we just went over to be considered true power creep. I think most of those were just natural progression of the game. Now, power creep is not a real word, like you can't find this in a dictionary, right? It's something that we in gaming sort of just made up as time went on. So some people's definition of power creep might be different than others. So let's take a look at two different definitions for power creep. So let's take a look at these two responses here. Power creep in gaming is when new content or features make older ones obsolete or irrelevant. Those are two important words, which can cause an imbalance and loss of diversity in the game. This can happen in multiplayer games, trading card games, and other competitive or collectible-based games. Let's take a look at another definition a little further down here. Power creep, uncountable, collectible. Okay, hold on. The situation is where successive updates or expansions to a game introduce more powerful units or abilities, leaving the older ones underpowered. These two things do mean different things, and that can obviously get a little bit confusing, right? For example, this bottom definition here is very, very vague. It's very, very loose and broad, and I don't really like that. That leaves the door open for so many different interpretations. The situation where successive updates or expansions to a game produce more powerful units or abilities, leaving the older ones underpowered. That naturally happens in just about any game you could possibly play that is live service. This is naturally going to happen, but would you really consider that power creep? I'm much more like this upper definition here, where they speak on how the units that are being released make older ones obsolete or irrelevant. That is much more defined, and I really like that definition, and this is what I typically would consider to be power creep. If a previous unit became irrelevant or obsolete, yeah, that's power creep. That's pushing another character out of the way to make room for another one, essentially. And when we think about it that way, dude, you can beat endgame content with some of the characters that came out in 1.0. So it's a little harder to say, oh yeah, Honkai Star Rail is full of power creep when you think about it like that. For example, even I myself have probably said something along the lines of Acheron is power creep, or maybe the closest thing to power creep we could get, but that's more of a buzzword or just a faster way of saying that this character is definitively powerful over everything else, rather than actually meaning like, oh yeah, she's so power creep that she made everybody else irrelevant. Because like, Acheron actually created a space of her own. She's the first Nihility character that operates in the way that she does. She literally created her own lane and stayed in it, rather than trying to take a lane away from somebody else. Now, I will admit, ever since I built up a super high-powered Acheron, I'm not really using my old units as much. So this is where things get kind of interesting, because despite the fact that I might not necessarily, by definition, consider Acheron to be power creep, she did make a lot of other units irrelevant when she released. And a lot of people are gonna say that Seele got Powercrept because she's just not that relevant anymore, but she's still arguably the most powerful quantum, like, main DPS unit, right? Because even if you want to consider Jade to be a more powerful unit, I don't really think you can say that, because Jade needs to be paired on a specific style team. She doesn't really want to be on like a mono quantum team, for example. She wants to be on like a follow-up style team rather than a pure mono quantum team. So Seele is still relevant in the realm of mono quantum. And so when you look at things a little bit more deeply, it's harder to say that power creep really exists in Honkai Star Rail. But at the same time, a lot of us aren't really using a lot of our older units anymore, right? But then again, we kind of are now. Honkai Star Rail ended up releasing a lot of endgame content that made characters like Himiko relevant again, Clara relevant, Herta relevant, right? People are even still using their Seele in certain situations if it calls for it. So I don't really think that true power creep exists in Honkai Star Rail, but let's try to wrap this up in a nice little bow here. All right, so because people's definition of what power creep is going to vary person to person, we're still going to hear people saying power creep all the time. In fact, even though I don't think power creep is actually real in Honkai Star Rail, like not true power creep, bro, I'm still gonna say power creep too, just like everybody else. I think the more important question here is, or way to interpret this is power creep really a problem in Honkai Star Rail or not? Because even though I don't think true power creep exists in Honkai Star Rail, I think we all know what we mean when we say power creep. It's just a shorter way of saying new character better. That's literally all we mean. But is this thing we call power creep really a problem in Honkai Star Rail? Well, I think it may have been more of a problem before, but I think Hoyoverse have done a pretty good job of managing the situation, because I don't think older players really feel the pressure to necessarily pull for some of the new characters that come out. Plenty of us would rather pull Eidolons of our already highly invested characters. But the newer player experience might be a little bit different. However, I think Hoyoverse have done a lot of things to rectify that. For example, Fei Xiao is the top DPS for the follow-up attack meta. And the follow-up attack meta is notoriously a really high investment. A lot of the best characters for that are 5-star characters, and they're harder to come by. You know what I mean? Waiting around for reruns kind of sucks. It is truly a highly invested team, despite being one of the best teams in the game right now. But Hoyoverse have released characters like March 7th's new form, the Hunt Path March 7th. They've also released characters like Mose. Both of them are 4-star characters that everyone could potentially get their hands on, or at least gives more opportunities for new players to get their hands on in order to be able to still play within these newer metas that develop, making power creep less of a problem than it might have used to have been earlier on in the game's lifespan. With a lot more options at our disposal, it makes what we call power creep less of an issue. Now, obviously, people are very self-indulgent, and they're going to want the best characters, the best artifacts, the best relics, the best this, the best that, the best everything, right? So people are still going to feel pressure to want to pull for the new high-powered characters that end up releasing, but the pressure is not as heavy as it used to be in the past of the game's lifespan. So, does power creep truly exist in Honkai Star Rail? Well, I don't think true power creep exists in Honkai Star Rail, but we're still gonna say power creep, right? But what we really mean is new best character for this slot, new best this, new best that, when we say power creep. Like Acheron power creeping all the other DPS characters when she came out. That just means that she's the new definitive DPS in the game. You could make the argument that power creep for Acheron was probably real. Like, if there's any power creep in the game, I think Acheron was probably the closest thing that we could have gotten to power creep. But power creep throughout the entire lifespan of the game, I don't think it goes that deep, man. So when someone says, oh, Firefly Powercrept Boot Hill for the Breaker slot, and it's like, nah, like, she's better than him on average, but that doesn't make Boot Hill irrelevant. He's still incredibly powerful whenever he is, like, utilized on a team against a physical weak enemy. So he's still gonna be relevant. Anyways, crazy how Fei Xiao Powercrept Doctor ratio, right? Anyways, stay tuned for the top 5 best characters in Honkai Star Rail updated video I'll be putting out soon. You like this kind of stuff, consider leaving a like and subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.